Hello everyone. In one of my previous videos, one of you suggested that I make a sourdough starter tutorial, and this is it. In this video, I'm sharing with you everything I know about the sourdough starter, and I'm hoping that by the end of this video, you are going to agree with me that the sourdough starter is not as complicated as some people will have you believe. So let's dive right in. First thing, what is a sourdough starter? Super simple. It's a mix of flour and water that over time, given room temperature, creates bacteria in it. That's as far as I know. Not a scientist here, so I'm going to leave it at that. If you want to know more how exactly that whole process works, you will have to do some research elsewhere. All right, question number 2. What is the difference between a sourdough starter and yeast? And when I say yeast here, I mean either the dry, the active, or the fresh yeast that you will find in most grocery stores. So in essence, there is no difference because sourdough starter is yeast as well. However, what you will find in the stores is, of course, commercially produced yeast. Yeast that has been, over the years, modified so that it produces very standard, very reliable results, which are that it rises whatever you're adding it into, whatever baking you're doing. Whereas the sourdough starter is yeast that's very much a live organism that's evolving, that's doing stuff. So it's much less predictable. So if you're asking, well, if it's both yeast, then why would I ever want to use a sourdough starter if you say it's unpredictable instead of the predictable results with the yeast you can buy at the store? So the difference we care about is that the sourdough starter is supposed to be healthy for you. Again, not a scientist here, but from what I've read, the way I understand it is that the sourdough starter contains a lot more different kinds of bacteria than the standardized, we'll call it that, standardized yeast that you find in the store. And we want the diversity in our gut. Also, the sourdough starter is supposed to be better at breaking down gluten in the flour in whatever you're baking again, which again is something that we want for our bodies to make it easier for our gut to deal with all the gluten that we are putting into it. So that's the basics. So there really is nothing wrong with the commercial yeast. And in many recipes, that's also why you will find both things added, a sourdough starter and some form of commercial yeast. It's usually at times when you may not want to do the whole process because the sourdough starter does take time to start working. And so if you want to skip a lot of the time needed for the final result, then you might find it beneficial adding some commercial yeast for that faster growth, faster rising, I should say, of your bread or whatever else you're doing. All right, question number 3, how do you make it? And here I have to share with you that I did not make mine. I got mine at a bread baking class that I went to about a year ago, and since then I've just kept working with that one starter that I got there. So that's actually my tip though. If you can, don't try to make one yourself. It's just one less thing to worry about from the list. So if you're getting started, if you can, you have a bakery nearby, see if maybe they would be able to give you some of their starter or if you can purchase it. I've heard that there are now like places and people that sell it online because the sourdough starter can survive in like a room temperature setting for a few days. So I could see that if it's in shipping for 2 days, that could work. So you could check online. You could also check any like local maybe apps or something like that, because I know here in the Czech Republic, we actually have an app where people register, and on a map, they pin their location and they say what kind of starter they have and that they're willing to give you a piece of it. So that's pretty cool, I think. But of course, there is always the option of making it yourself. Now, again, I have exactly zero experience with that, but from what I've seen online, it shouldn't be that difficult. It's just that it's quite a process over a few days. You're basically just keep mixing flour and water, letting it sit till the next day, remove some part, add more flour and water, and you keep doing this for a couple of days until the colony of bacteria starts like really evolving and doing its work. One more point here. There are also people that will tell you, or they will talk about how ancient their sourdough starter is, that it's 300 years old because it traveled from, it used to be used in Italy, and then, people just kept using it over and over. I've also heard that really doesn't make any sense, or not that it doesn't make sense. It's just that the bacteria, it's not like you have one bacteria in there that's 300 years old and it just keeps working, it's this tiny grandma, and, that's just ridiculous. It's like this new bacteria that gets created over and over and over, it's reproducing. So I've heard that once you take your sourdough starter home, let's say you got it at the bakery or wherever, somebody sent it to you, you take it home, within a couple of weeks, if your sourdough starter got tested, it would have pretty much nothing in common with the previous one, because you fed it your flour and your water and it lived in your environment, and that's all the things that influence the final result, and they just kind of take over the whole process. So if you're thinking about getting the sourdough starter somewhere, it's really not that important how old the original sourdough starter is. Like, it can be, a year old and it should work. As long as, I should point out that it is an established one, meaning that person or that place is using it on a relatively regular basis and they've had success with it, let's say. That should be your signal that, yes, this is something that's working. There is that well-established colony of bacteria that I can take home and transform into my own thing. All right, topic number 4, how do you keep your sourdough starter alive? Because, as we have established, it is a live organism. There is bacteria in it, and just like any other live organism, it needs to feed. So that's what you need to do. You need to feed it flour and water. Only those 2 ingredients, just like the ones that have started the whole process, you need to give that to your starter. Now, on a regular basis, but we'll get to that in just a minute. The flour, any kind of flour will do, even nut flours from what I have read. I don't have a vast experience of giving my starter all kinds of flour, but anything works because it has the nutrients, let's say, that the bacteria needs. So for the flour, the general rules that I have heard is you should stick to the flour that is then used in your recipe. So I have heard that, for example, let's say you're making bread most of the time, you use all-purpose for your bread and you feed your sourdough starter all-purpose as well. Let's say that you then switch to a rye bread. So that's, different kind of flour. You feed the starter rye flour as well, and then you use rye flour for the bread. If you then wanted to make, let's say, something sweet that uses, again, all-purpose, the rye has very specific taste. And because it's in the starter that you're adding to your baking project, you will be able to taste that rye flour in it as well. So that's why you should try and stick to the flour that you're using in your baking recipe, because then like you're reducing this, multiple tastes in one dish. So I feel like the safest thing to do is to just do all purpose all the time, not even worry about anything else. But if you do feed your starter something else, just be aware that it might taste different, smell different, work a little bit different as well. I mean, all those different kinds of flour are different, and it is a living organism. So you might see slightly different results with it. And then you add the water as well. Or actually, I should say I do the reverse. I first add the water, mix the starter in a little bit, the one that I already had previously, mix it in, and then I add the flour, mix all that in. Now, the proportion of how much water you feed it to how much flour you feed it is going to then determine the stiffness of that starter. So if you feed it, which normally you will see in most places like a 1-to-1 ratio, I don't know, 1 cup of water, 1 cup of flour, you will get a very runny starter. And that's what you very often see in all the different images online. It's like all these bubbles on the surface, and it's like maybe like a slightly thicker pancake dough, I think. Because I don't know, I don't have that kind of starter, because I like my starter to be a little bit more stiff. Now, I would say that on the other end of the stiffness spectrum, let's say, is a starter that's called Levito Madre. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologies if I'm not. But basically, that's a starter that you feed. I think it's 2 parts flour, 1 part water, right? So you would do 1 cup water, 2 cups flour. And it's so stiff that you actually have to work it with your hands. Like, it's not enough to mix it in a bowl or a jar, but you actually have to mix everything with your hands, create it into like a little ball, which then again like expands and creates all the bubbles and everything. Well, at first, before I started baking bread and all the things, I thought that like you needed either one or the other. But it turns out like you can have just whatever in between as well. I preferred working with the stiff starter, so I wanted that, but I really didn't want to take the extra time of like rolling things into a ball with my hands and all of that. So I've discovered that what I do really works best for me, where I actually do like somewhere between 60 to 80 grams of water, and then about like 120 grams of flour. Sorry, I don't know what proportions those are, but I then just mix it with the spoon, and it's like this almost like a shaggy dough. I don't even know what to, link the consistency to, but I think you've seen the B-roll footage, so you know what I mean. Also, if you want to test out these different consistencies, you can do so anytime you want. Like, you can start with a very liquid one, and then in the next feed, you're feeding it a little bit more flour to turn it into the more stiff one. Maybe you think that doesn't work for you, and in the next feed, you just turn it back into the liquid one. Like, this is absolutely, goes from one to the other super easily, so you really do not have to worry about this. The one thing you do need to understand is the amount of how much you're feeding versus what you're already starting with. So what I usually keep is like about a spoonful of my starter. That's about like 20 grams. And you should feed it at least its own weight, because you just imagine there is all this individual bacteria and they all want to eat. Right? So if you fed them, I don't know, half of their size, imagine like there is 100 little bacteria cells or whatever, and they all want to get a bite of that flour and the water. So imagine you give those 100 only 50 grams of flour or 50 grams of the flour water mixture. They're all, only every other bacteria is going to get a bite. The other half is going to have nothing. So that's obviously like super oversimplified, but I think you get what I mean. You want to make sure that the bacteria has enough stuff to eat to reproduce a lot to create this nice and bubbly starter for you. So the ratio of like how much starter I have versus how much I feed it is about, I feed it 10 times as much as what I have. So if you think that I have, 20 grams to start with, I feed it about 200 grams of the flour and water mixture. If you take, let's say, like the 70 or 80 grams of water plus the 120 grams of flour, that's 200 in total versus 20 grams that I had in the beginning. So I hope that makes sense. And also keeping with this, the more you feed it, the more time you will then have to wait for it to get to the point where you can use it. So if I were to feed it only the 20 grams that it weighed in the beginning, maybe it would take it an hour. Again, just, all that bacteria just takes one bite and they're done, right? Job's finished. But if I give them a lot to process, it takes them a lot more time to get through all of it, right? I really hope that all of this oversimplification just makes sense and it makes the process a lot more understandable. Now, the one point that I really want everyone to understand is that you only need to feed your starter when you want to make something. And for the rest of the time, it's in the fridge. So you will see this, I feel like, everywhere, that people will say that, oh, you need to, feed your starter at least like once every other day, or maybe once every 3 or 4 days, or maximum 7 days if it's in the fridge. Well, in my experience, it's completely fine if you leave it in the fridge for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then you decided you want to make something, take it out of the fridge, feed it, and it works. I think for me personally, 2 or 3 weeks was the maximum before I wanted to make something, so I had to take it out and feed it. But I have seen a video by someone else, can't remember his name now, here on YouTube, who did a test, and he had like just some little scrapings of a starter that was definitely like 50 plus days in the fridge, maybe like 57 if I recall correctly, and it still worked. Like, he just took it out. It took a lot of time for it to start working and get adjusted again to the room temperature, but it worked. So you really do not need to think about your sourdough starter beyond the time when you want to use it. The important part is that it needs to stay in the fridge. You can, again, using some kids-like oversimplification, imagine that by putting the starter in the fridge, you're putting the bacteria to sleep. When they sleep, they're not doing anything, they don't need anything from you, they're just happily sleeping in the fridge. When you want them to wake up and you want them to do their work of eating up, creating all those bubbles, creating that rising power, you need them to be out at room temperature where they wake up and they can do that job. All right, my next point is the difference between active and discard sourdough starter. So in different recipes, you will see they call for different things, either the active bubbly starter or discard. So active, you can see this as like a stage of the sourdough starter, basically. Active starter is the starter at its peak. It's when you have fed it, you've given it some time to, again, eat up through everything you fed it. It has risen up. It has all those bubbles in there. It's ready to be used. Discard is anything that is pretty much beyond this peak until you feed it again. I guess that stage between when you feed it and it becomes the right active, window, that's not really used for anything. You've just fed it, you're waiting it for it to be active, right? So what I didn't really understand before is why people have discard. Why do they feel the need to do something with discard? And so this might take a little bit, so brace yourself. But for me, because I'm measuring how much I'm feeding my sourdough starter, I never ever have discard. From the bread baking class, I brought home 20 grams of sourdough starter in a little container. When I wanted to make bread, I fed it pretty much the exact amount of the mixture of flour and water that I knew I needed for my recipe. So I know that my recipe calls for 160 grams of starter. So I know that I need to feed my starter 160 grams of the mixture combined, flour and water. And I already mentioned that I do a slightly different amounts of the flour and water, but I feed it so that it is more or less somewhere around 160 of the total combined. Let's say the 60 grams of water, 100 grams of flour, right? So I feed it that. I use the 160 for my bread, and then I'm again left with the original 20 grams, which I put back into the fridge, and I only take it out next time I need to make bread. I again measure everything, again have just the exact amount I need with only 20 grams left. I hope that makes sense so far. Where discard comes in is if you don't measure and you feed your starter more than what you will actually need in your recipe. So let's say that, again, let's use the example. I came back with 20 grams of starter. Let's say I would overfeed it and I would feed it, 300 grams of the mixture in total. At the end of the rising, I would have 320 grams of starter total. Out of that, I would take out 160 grams, right, for my bread recipe. And I would be left with 160 grams of the starter, which I would put in the fridge. A week later, I want to make bread again. I need to feed my starter. Now, my starter is a jar of 160 gram inactive starter, right? And I need to feed it. In our feeding question, we already determined that you need to feed it at least its own weight, but ideally more. So let's say I fed it, 400 grams of the combined flour and water. So at the end of the rising, I would have, 560 grams of active starter, right? I would take 160, leaving me with 400 grams of basically at this point inactive discard starter. A week later, I want to make bread again. I hope you see where I'm going. Like, if you don't measure and you kind of overfeed, at the next feed, you will have to overfeed in order to feed all the bacteria that's in there. And like this, you're collecting more and more and more of starter that you don't need for your bread recipe. So you end up with a lot of starter that you just have no use for. It's discard, right? And you have two options, really. You can either throw some away so that you don't have to keep adding and buying bigger and bigger jars to, fit your starter into. So you either throw some away and you, again, go back down to maybe 20 grams of your starter and you work with that, or you need to have some use for it. Hence the discard recipes. Did that make sense? Please, someone comment if that made sense, because I know that this can be I think complicated to understand with like the feeding and how much you need to feed it, but this is how discard gets created, and this is why people make discard recipes. Now, the difference in using active versus discard, like if you ask, well, why do you even need active? Why can't you just feed it and then use it whenever? Well, because you need the super active starter at the, peak to have that full rising power. You will not be able to make nice, well-risen bread with discard sourdough starter. It's just not, the bacteria is not there, like ready to make the bread rise, let's say. So that's what you need the active starter for, that really big rising power. So that's why you will also see discard being used in recipes that don't really require the dough to rise. I've seen tons of recipes for things like pancakes or crepes, or even like pizza dough, things that just you don't associate with this big rising power again. I could see another reason why people would want to have big quantities of starter, including the discard, and that's when you've gotten to this flow and you have familiarized yourself with lots of recipes, and you have no problem just throwing something together. When you see that you have way too much starter to begin with, you just throw together, some pancakes or something with the discard. Then you feed your regular, get it to where you want it to be. You make bread with it, or you don't even maybe use it. You just keep the discard and you use that, because you just have, again, a lot of recipes in your repertoire that you can choose from. It is something that I have thought about before, because that has kind of stopped me from using recipes that use discard, because I just never have any on hand. So I feel like maybe in the future I will get to that stage when I'm no longer measuring how much I'm feeding my starter, and I just eyeball it, and I know that I can use the discard in multiple different ways, but I'm not there yet. So if you are a beginner like me, I would highly suggest measure how much you feed your sourdough starter to not get into this predicament. Oh, and I guess the one other scenario where you would need some use for discard is if you are making your sourdough starter from the beginning, because if you remember when I was talking about that, the whole process is about mixing flour and water, then removing some part, throwing that away, adding new flour and water, and so on. And you do this a couple of times. So if you're not comfortable with throwing away all that flour and water, then you can use it in discard recipes. All right, we've talked about this quite a bit already, but how do you use it? And I'm talking about when a recipe calls for active starter. So you take out your original starter from the fridge, hopefully that's where you keep it. You feed it flour and water, you wait a couple hours, and then your starter is ready. Now, there are a lot of little hacks that people use to test the readiness of it. There is I think it's called the float test, if I'm not mistaken. They would put rubber bands on their jars to see how much it has risen. In my opinion, just look at it. Look at your starter. What you should see is bubbles on the side of the jar. If you are using a glass jar, which I find convenient for this purpose, if you're using a more stiffer starter like I am, then you will see a little cap forming at the top. If you're using the purely liquidy starter, then there will be bubbles on top as well. And I have fed my sourdough starter this morning, and I have been taking little clips of it throughout the day, about every hour or so. So you can really see the progression from a very just shaggy dough at the bottom of the glass, and then it slowly starts rising. There is bubbles that start appearing, and that cap starts forming. So when you see all of those signs, your starter is ready. And again, one more thing where I feel like people just overcomplicate it is they create all of these tests and they feel like there's only I don't know, like a 10-minute window in this whole process where your sourdough starter is ready and it needs to be used. Otherwise, you will never be able to bake bread with it. That's not the case. It's not the case. The active and peak window is so much broader. And again, kind of like in my what I've learned from bread making video, we're not going for perfection, right? Yes, if you want to get a Michelin star for your amazing bread, then sure, do all those tests. But if you just want nice tasty bread, then there is a long window that you can use to make bread with the sourdough starter that you made. So as long as it has those, again, bubbles, it has risen about half, maybe more, maybe a little bit less. You see those things, go ahead and use it. You do need to keep in mind when estimating how much time it's going to take the sourdough starter between the feeding time and when it's going to be ready, it's going to be a couple hours at least. All of this is going to depend on how long has it been sitting in the fridge inactive and how much you have fed it compared to its own original weight. The longer it's in the fridge and the more you feed it, the longer time it's going to need to process everything. In my experience, where I keep the starter in the fridge for a couple of days, maybe a week, and I feed it about 10 times its original amount, it takes it somewhere around 6 hours. I would say about 6 hours from when I feed it in the morning until the afternoon when I know I'm ready to bake. All right, and my last point is what to do when your starter is not at its best. And what I mean by this is when it either looks or smells funny, especially the smell, I think, is a good signal that there is something off with the starter. But even the look, like there might be these black dots on it, or I've heard people talk about mold as well. So what I would always try to do as the first thing is from the jar, take very tiny amount, like really just a teaspoon, maybe half a teaspoon, put it into a completely new jar, feed it a little bit. You don't need much. Have it do its thing, leave it out for a couple hours, then smell it, look at it again. If it still has the weird smell or look, again, take a tiny amount, put it in a new jar, do the same, just feed it a tiny bit. And so like try this a couple times, see if you can smell that the smell is no longer there or it's reducing, and that way you can kind of get it back to its shape. Obviously throw out the rest, the one that still smells bad. This can happen, I think, mainly if you leave it out of the fridge and you don't feed it for a while, because what happens is the bacteria dies, right? They're dying, and that's what produces the smell. Again, no scientist here, please don't quote me on this. That's how I understand it. So it has happened to me in exactly this scenario, that I kept it out of the fridge. I didn't feed it, I think, for about a week. And that's when I noticed that it definitely didn't look or smell right. But luckily I was able to cure it this way, where I did, I think, like 2 or 3 of these transfers, and then it was just back in shape and I could use it again. It may not work, so you may have to throw the starter away, but do give it a few tries before you do, because it would be a shame if you've put some effort, time, possibly money into acquiring it, to just throw it away at the first sign of something being off. All right, and that is all the knowledge I had for you about sourdough starter. I hope you found it useful. And again, like I said in the beginning, I hope you now feel like the sourdough starter is a lot less complicated thing than people make it out to be. And with that, I am signing off, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.